First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to your meeting this evening. I am Len DeYoung, the Executive Director of the Pompano River Watershed Coalition. I want to thank Joanna for helping make my transition to your meeting a very successful one, so thank you very much. If I've done this right, I've got about a 15-minute presentation with two major objectives. One is informational on the water allocation use ordinance, and two is to solicit your help in terms of moving the process forward on a regional basis, and I'll explain some of the hurdles we've found on our basin, specifically within the town of Southbury. Not working. Am I at the wrong angle? Okay. Sure it's not. It was working before. I did a test drive. And there we go. Thank you. Just a little brief introduction for those who may not know about the Pompano River Watershed Coalition. We were founded in 1999. We like to say that our core work is science and our hallmark is education, everything to do with the protection of the water resources. And when I say water resources, the river and the aquifers within the 90 square mile area of the Pompano River Watershed Coalition. Pompano River Watershed. Brief overview, this is our watershed. We have three major subbasins. They flows between the Wikipemie, the Nottawaga, and the Pompano. Actually a total of 6 subbasins. We touch 7 towns in the watershed, but we have 8 towns as part of our coalition. The percentage of our water does leave the watershed in an out-of-basin transfer to the town of Oxford. So when we talk about the communities that we're involved with in our coalition, we include the town of Oxford. We're very fortunate to have, while we're a relatively young organization back to 1999, this particular geography, or water resource geography, has been studied since the late 1800s by USGS. One of the reasons that USGS was interested early on is we're basically a mirror of what happens in the Connecticut River Valley. So by studying at a smaller scale the Pompano Basin, they learned an awful lot about the much larger Connecticut River Valley, and we benefit from having that information. We've gone shoulder to shoulder for many, many years with COG. We're very pleased to say that, and had some great successes, wonderful mapping studies, other water resource studies. Most recently, I just wanted to list some things that we've been working on with the COG folks. That would be dam safety. Maybe Aaron doesn't want me to bring this up, but MS4 compliance. River Smart. Some of you in the room have participated in the River Smart presentations. River Smart is a best management practice for those who are associated with the rivers, both residential as well as businesses. And COG, through a generous funding support, has allowed us to create this information, working along with partnering organizations like the Housatonic Valley Association. And we've been out and about some of the various towns in Naugatuck Valley COG. And this information is available courtesy of, to a great extent, COG. We're very pleased about that collaborative effort. We're also working on stream flow regulations and classifications. You may be aware that streams throughout Connecticut are receiving their classifications. Water utility coordinating committees. COG is playing a role in regards to the new proposal to move from 7 water utility coordinating committees to 3 water utility coordinating committees, and we were also involved in that process. We're involved heavily in the state water planning, as are the COGs, So on the bottom it says the Water Planning Council Advisory Group, which the Pompano River Watershed Coalition is a member of, that reports to the Connecticut Water Planning Council. And in 2012, they defined drought as that more than a physical phenomenon or natural event, it in fact results from a relationship between natural event demands on water supply and is often exaggerated by human activity. So just keep that in mind, if you would. This is a precipitation. I think it's when originally talked to Aaron about setting up this meeting, I wasn't thinking we might be in a drought, but you never know. Our state is actually an interesting one at this point. We're a very small state. We have areas of much more drought and other areas where we have plentiful rain. I think that's somewhat characteristic about what we're talking about regarding climate change in terms of events being more localized than broader events. This is actually a few days old. This goes back to October 1st, but I wanted to show it to you because the area, as you see, the kind of the brownish area, which hangs over the Pomperog and the Naugatuck Valley, is the area throughout the state that has had the least amount of rainfall. There's been an improvement in the last week or so, but I'm not convinced that we still may not be heading towards a winter drought. As you likely know, USGS maintains gauges throughout the state, and one of those gauges is in the Pomperog River. This is the gauge history of the flow in the Pomperog River. You look to the far right, the bottom of the gauge, you'll see that we're touching the 3.2 cubic feet per second. That was taken just prior to the last rain. Today we're at 7.7 cubic feet per second. At 3.2 cubic feet per second, and even at 7.7 cubic feet per second, we are at historical lows in the Pomperog River. The USGS has been monitoring flows in the Pomperog dating back to 1935, and at 3.2 cubic feet per second, it was one of the lowest recorded flows ever in the Pomperog River. The Naugatuck River at Beacon Falls is at 88 cubic feet per second today. We're in about the 1 percentile in Pomperog, and at Naugatuck, Naugatuck is at the 11 percentile. So you can see how that earlier picture of rainfall is impacting our area on a very localized basis. As I also mentioned, the coalition is concerned about groundwater, both quality and quantity. There's a USGS gauging station in the town of Southbury that measures the groundwater level in the stratified drift. You're probably familiar with the fact that stratified drift is where the majority of the public water supply well water comes from. And you can see again to the far right the drop as we saw back in 2010. That drop is something very important for us to keep an eye on. The rainfall will improve the rivers and surface water much quicker than it will in the aquifer. So we're watching what happens in regards to this drought, because this drought will be indicative in terms of well capacities for both the public water suppliers as well as the residential wells. So now let's talk about the water use and drought application. Why take action? Well, I'll suggest to you it's a matter of public safety. I'll suggest it's a matter of protecting the environment. Certainly impacts our quality of life. And as I've mentioned just before, abnormal weather patterns are the new norm. So since we're all stewards of our water, all actions have impact. We see partners in the process being the municipalities, the water utilities and the agencies, the regional planners, you all, as well as the water users. This is again this pictorial saying that we're all in the play here. If you look kind of nationally at successful programs that do have what are called drought ordinances or water use allocation ordinances, they're typically underpinned by state statute or policy. The state drought plan is currently under review. It has been under review for a number of years. There's a group of very highly qualified folks who are trying to finish the draft state plan, and based upon the results of the state plan, that will trickle down, no pun intended, to us at the local level. Successful programs nationwide work in conjunction with the water utilities or regional water districts. They vary in approach regarding stages and measures. Most of them, or all of them, emphasize outdoor and non-essential use, and they typically achieve targeted goals of a 10 to 20% reduction in range. And I want to stress the last one. Their success is usually seen without punitive enforcement, although enforcement schedule is important. Having a drought plan in place, having an ordinance in place, just in itself as an educational outreach, tends to have the public focus more on their water use without actually having to issue punitive enforcement. Drought levels and why do we need an ordinance, or why might I suggest we need an ordinance? There is no enforcement power to require conservation. There is two exceptions to that currently in Connecticut. Back in 1995, the town of Greenwich passed a drought ordinance, and they do have enforcement power within that. And then more recently, the town of Putnam, using the model ordinance that you have reviewed, passed an ordinance that also has enforcement power within. Proactive conservation practices are growing, but a prolonged drought may outrun the best of measures. I think you're all aware that there's been great success in educating the consumer about conservation. There's been great success in the types of equipment that comes out in terms of water use equipment, appliances, all of which have added up significantly in terms of pulling back in regards to the amount of water used in a home and a business. But with a prolonged drought, even the best of practices may someday dictate the need for an ordinance. Municipalities and officials play a key role in water allocation and use during periods of drought. So I mentioned the State Water Plan. The State Water Plan was a product of Public Act 14163. It's an act concerning the responsibilities of the Water Planning Council. The Water Planning Council is comprised of a representative from PURA, the Public Utility Regulatory Authority, a representative from DEEP, a representative from the State Health Department, and a representative from OPM. And the Water Planning Council has been charged with developing a state watershed plan by July 1st, 2017. Actually, that should be State Water Plan, not watershed. I apologize. A State Water Plan by July 1st, 2017. That's a work in progress, and I can tell you there's a great deal of work left to do. I have the pleasure of serving on a couple committees that are engaged with developing the plan. One of those committees, the Science and Technical Committee, meets tomorrow, and we're formulating the data that's required to write the plan. Now, within that plan is this last bullet, and that last bullet says promote the adoption of municipal ordinance based on the State Connecticut Model Water Use Restriction Ordinance for municipal water emergencies. I have no idea how quickly that's going to surface on the radar screen and how quickly that's going to impact you as planners and municipalities. I can tell you it's in the regulations. I can tell you that it will be a charge of the Water Planning Council. It will more than likely be addressed in the State Water Plan. So, as I started my presentation, one of the reasons I'm here is informational. If you're not aware of this, I'd like you to be aware of it, that that Public Act specifically says that the Water Planning Council is charged with adopting municipal ordinances. The summaries of the model water use ordinance include authority. The ordinance implements the municipal's authority to impose water use restrictions. Restrictions may include, and if you go through the model ordinance, you'll see a number of these, so I won't read through them, but these are typical bullets in terms of water use restrictions. The ordinance also requires notification, newspaper, reverse 9/11, other. And then, as I've already mentioned, there are enforcement considerations, perhaps by the building inspector, perhaps by local police. They suggest in the model ordinance fines for the first up to $100, second to $200. There's been a great deal of discussion about whether or not the local police how much of a burden this will be to the local police, and whether it's fair to local law enforcement in regards to moving this forward. I can tell you from our discussions in Southbury that local police actually were very supportive of this. I'm not sure how that will be in your respective communities. In extreme cases, the municipality may order the water company to curtail water service, and then of course there are exemptions for livelihood, health, and sanitation. So this is kind of a breakdown of parts of what you see in the ordinance. Locally, I just want to talk about the town of Southbury. We have a long history and somewhat a frustrating history of moving a water use and allocation ordinance forward. If Ed Edelson was here, who's sort of the CEO, first selectman of Southbury, I think he would share that frustration in saying that he wishes at this point the town of Southbury would have adopted a water use allocation. We started back in 2009 with the Pompano River Watershed Coalition, having received funding from the Connecticut Institute of Water Resources to do some watershed planning. We did a drought tabletop exercise. We developed a white paper that outlined the challenges, including development of a water use ordinance. And the Board of Selectmen agreed by resolution that they reviewed the white paper and in general agreement with the challenge identified and initial corrective actions outlined. And they, of course, they also said that it's understood that the foundation funding for activities will require confirmation and support of the town. So they've essentially said, we're in favor, we want to look more closely at what it means, and we want to look more closely at what it costs. Now this goes back 5 years ago. And we've had numerous discussions, numerous meetings with the Southbury business community. Most recently, this takes back about, I'd say about a year or so ago, I met with the Board of Selectmen to see if they wanted PRWC to write a draft ordinance. Instead of them asking us to write a draft ordinance, they asked us to convene a stakeholder work group to revisit the concept of an ordinance. And that is what PRWC did. We convened representative key stakeholders, including Ed, the town CEO, town planner, law enforcement, public water supplier. Aaron was there participating, business association, Southbury Business Association, representative from agriculture, representative from the Pompano Health District, and other environmental organizations. So our role was to, as we're sitting here this evening, look at the model ordinance, talk about the pros and cons, and then draw a conclusion that PRWC was charged with to represent to the Board of Selectmen in regards to whether or not we go forward with drafting an ordinance for their review, or whether some other action needs to take place. And what happened was, and these were the observations from the work group, was that the water supplier, in this case the Heritage Village Water Company, very supportive of conservation and drought, but also not supportive of having the town of Southbury on its own introduce a water use ordinance. And in part because it's, to a great extent, it's because they're a multi-town provider. They provide water to the town of Middlebury, they provide water to the town of Oxford, and the CEO, who was party to this process, said that I can't support a water use ordinance unless I have a clear message to all of my customers. Another issue of concern was other basin communities should adopt an ordinance. In our basin, upstream of us are the towns of Woodbury and Bethlehem. And there was a great deal of discussion about if Southbury adopted an ordinance and one didn't exist in Woodbury and didn't exist in Bethlehem, how would the public feel, how would the public react about them being placed on water conservation, whereas the neighboring communities were not? So this is where the concept of looking at this more regionally started to develop. Other observations were that the developing state drought plan brings uncertainty since it's not completely authored yet. And should we wait for that before there's any action taken locally? We did conclude that private well owners must comply. We felt that for the messaging, it would be very difficult to suggest a drought ordinance for the public water supplies without also addressing the private well owners, with the understanding that the private wells do not always respond as significantly to initial drought as the public supplies do. Sometimes Actually, the private wells will be more of a problem. Other times, they lag behind in terms of any issues. We also agreed that a memorandum of understanding should be developed with the water supplier. Additional effort is needed for early outreach for water conservation. I think all of us kind of simplified by, kind of summed up by saying in its simplest form, an ordinance is a tool to assist the water supplier with messaging and policing. Southbury may be the wrong town to be experimenting with this. Again, the good news is there's a CEO who's very much in favor of a drought plan, a water use and allocation ordinance. On the other hand, it's a private entity. It's not a municipally owned water system. So there's that additional layer of the private entity versus the municipal entity, and the municipal entity not having control totally of its destiny relevant to water supply. So it adds a different layer than, say, if we went into a town where you were the municipal water supplier and you didn't have that extra layer of communication. So the work group recommendation was to investigate a broader or regional approach to adopting and implementing a water allocation use ordinance. As I started to say, and this is the close of my presentation, I'm here for two reasons. One, informationally, to let you know that the Public Act 14163 calls out municipal ordinance. I can't crystal ball how quickly that will come before you as towns. It's out there, it's being discussed, but I'm not going to suggest how quickly that's going to come to be. There's a lot more other work that has to be done. But I wanted you to be aware of it. I wanted you to be aware that there's a model ordinance, which is what we can share electronically and also distributed hard copies. The other reason I'm here is because I could use your help in terms of, is this an opportunity for COG, for the planners, to work on a more of a regional basis? And I don't know if that's the broad Naugatuck Valley COG or whether it's a section of the COG specifically on a basin issues. For example, our area would be Woodbury, Bethlehem, Oxford, and Southbury, for the planners to get together. How would the planners of those four towns feel to get together to try to work through this? So that's the request for help in terms of whether you have any comments. I want to thank you. That's contact information if you need to reach me. And with that, I'll close and answer any questions. So may I ask on a regional approach? Let me walk in front. I apologize for being to your back. On a regional approach, now I'm confronted with driving this forward. Is there, and I know this takes time to think through, but is there benefit for having a drought ordinance looked at on a COG level versus at a municipal level? Tough question, but is there benefit to doing that? Or does it make more sense to keep it local and more close to home and have the municipalities work? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll jump into the frying pan here. Obviously, water is a regional issue. That's the way I see it, okay, because we're all affected by it. As your map shows, eastern part of the state right now is a surplus. We had a drought. I don't know exactly where we stand after the rain we've had, but I've seen the brook behind my house go from flooding streets and over bridges to actually drying up. Not this year, it hasn't dried up, which I'm surprised, but so it's your approach. Conservation is definitely an issue. I think infrastructure has to be an issue. Look what's happened in California recently. What's happened in Georgia a few years ago. I think planning is for these things definitely the right step to go. But you hit right on the head. What do you do if one town makes an ordinance and another one doesn't? But we all hate Big Brother coming down from the state.
Right.
So it comes down to the people in the watershed area come up with their own agreement.
Does it belong at the planning level, do you think?
That's something I have to think about.
Okay, that's fair.
Just
versus the
tonight.
CEO level versus the planning level versus somewhere else.
Well, the CEO level would definitely have to be involved because they're the ones who have to present the ordinances. I know I'll bring this information back to our board of selectmen, zoning, and conservation. but ultimately it comes down to the chief elected officials. You know,
I think my next step will be to reach out to the planners within the service area of the Heritage Village Water Company. Maybe present something similar to this to them and solicit their input and their support and see where that takes us. But I didn't know if maybe there's a better way of going about doing that.
Top of my head, I'm not sure.
Sure. Yes.
Are you suggesting the COG would be watered, please?
No. No, I'm suggesting that the COG would be a vehicle for the municipalities to understand the municipal ordinance and then to decide to adopt it or not. You see, there are a couple layers here. You've got the municipalities that are served by the private entity like we're experiencing, where you've got a regional player. And then you've got the municipalities who have their own water supply. And then there are some municipalities in here that I don't think have a major water supply in their community. So maybe far less of an issue. However, you still have drought and private well owners too. So I'm just wondering if COG is a vehicle to communicate. First of all, if you think there is value to such an ordinance, is COG the vehicle to communicate to the municipalities about this model use ordinance and help move it forward? I mean, I have my own, I don't want to call it a problem, I have my own challenge within our watershed, the one I've already explained to you. The bigger picture is, at some point, and Aaron and I talked briefly about this, at some point, depending upon what the Board of Planning Council does, they're going to reach out to try to move a water use ordinance into municipalities. So, if anything I've done this evening is just to let you know about that, if you didn't already know about it, then I'm glad I did. So I'm not sure I have it. I certainly don't have it figured out what COG's going to do. But I see them more as not the police, not the water police. I think that has to be done at the local level. And it's interesting, from the towns that do have the drought ordinances, the water police don't really step in. It's very seldom do they have to write a ticket, if you want to call it that, even if you look at California, because it's usually neighborhood pressure, it's just a better understanding of how bad things are to get people motivated to conserve water. There are exceptions.
Any other questions? Comments? Go
Well, I
ahead.
was just going to say, I mean, I think from the COG's perspective, I think the role we could play as a facilitator of the discussion. You know, we could
That's
help
much better than I said it.
Yeah, bring together the planners or the chief elected officials, and again, provide a forum for that education. I guess the question I also had, a couple of things sort of struck me. It's like the issue here is water use. So it really doesn't matter where the supply comes from. If you're a user, you need to sort of, restrict your use during the drought. So, it doesn't, that's why I think, private people on private wells, they're still a user and they should, comply with the regulations. Whether or not you have to, if you're within a watershed or not, that's a public supply watershed, you're still receiving water from somewhere, so you should be, interested in conserving as much as you possibly could. So again, I think the approach at a regional level makes a lot of sense, but it may need to go beyond a watershed level as well.
Mm-hmm.
You've got 8 towns in your watershed, but there's 19 towns in the North Valley that also could benefit from this kind of discussions and the different watersheds. They do get water from somewhere.
Okay, well, let's keep that in mind, if you would, please, and we'd be willing to certainly follow up when you think time is right to facilitate that type of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
I did bring an informational sheet with me from Greenwich. I mentioned that Greenwich adopted, this is actually not their water use ordinance. This is a public information sheet, which I thought was very well done in terms of why a copy with, you're more than welcome. And with that, I want to thank you very much. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you
I
very
want
much.
to acknowledge
Chairman.
Aaron,
Thank you.
Aaron Booth was also. he was
Aaron,
the
thank you.
First